Hi everyone, and welcome to Cosmia Festival Book Club, the February 2021 edition. I'm Dave, you're very welcome. So this is our second edition of our newly rebranded book club, and we are here to talk about Ancillary Justice by Leckie. I've got a lot of things in front of me, so you'll see my eyes go all over the place. Apologies for that in advance. So welcome to this meeting. We've got a great book to talk about this time. This is a reread for me rather than a new book, but I think that's it's nice to mix those up. And it was a really lovely experience rereading this book, something that I've enjoyed in the past, and then I wanted to kind of revisit and talk to you all about. So as always, the format is going to be, I've got some stuff that I want to talk about. I've got some thoughts I had when I was reading the book, but the chat is open for you to give me your comments, your feedback, and to drop those into the chat. I'll read out ones that are pertinent to the conversation, but I won't give your name away necessarily. I might put them on the screen if they're particularly useful for our discussion. And hopefully we'll have a nice back and forth about this really interesting book before we get to the end of our hour. So you're very welcome for this next hour. I will just point out, you might see in this side of the screen a link to our Ko-Fi. This is just a chance if you want to support the channel or support Cosmia Festival in general. It just helps us kind of pay the bills. You can do a small donation there if you think this is good content and you want more of it in the future. The last thing I want to point out, normally Cosmia Book Club is powered by coffee. Last month's book was very coffee focused, but we're on tea this month, and if you've read the book, you will understand why. On that note, the normal spoiler warnings apply. I'm going to be talking about this book. I'm going to be talking about what happens in this book. So if you've not read it yet and you want to read it, then this is the time to tune out. Go away, read the book, and then catch up on this afterwards on the stream. You can still leave comments, still get into the conversation and discussions afterwards. You'd be really, really welcome. Okay. So what are we talking about? We're talking about this book by author Leckie. It was published in 2013 and it won basically all the awards. So I've got the kind of paperback edition, which proudly and very rightly proclaims that it won the Hugo, the Nebula and the Arthur C. Clarke, which is not quite a clean sweep of everything, but that's a pretty good recommendation, I think, of how good a book is. And it kind of came a little bit from nowhere, an author that wasn't necessarily on anybody's radar, but really did well. So let me tell you a little bit about the author. One thing that I would highly recommend, there's some really interesting interviews with her, not only in the back of this book, but online, talking about the writing of this book and some of the ideas and the principles. And something that's really cool is that she is really happy with the idea of people bringing their own meanings to this story. She's not just interested in her interpretation, even though she's often quite clear about what she was trying to do. She's also happy for people to go into their own direction, which is perfect for the Cosmia Book Club and what we do here. So it's excellent. So Leckie is an American author. And this is this is the book that was kind of a bit of a breakthrough, really. She had a lot of short stories published, like a lot of authors starting out in short stories. And she was basically a stay-at-home mum. She fancied doing the National Novel Writing Month and kind of drafted this out. And then she ended up going to the Clarion West Writers Workshop, studying under Octavia Butler. And then she spent about 6 years then writing up this as a story. And then it was kind of published within a year or so. So she as soon as it was written, she was kind of away, and it forms the first part of a trilogy. Now, I want to point out I've only read this book. I've got too many other books in my life. I haven't got around to reading the second and third books, but I think that's perfect for this conversation because I don't want to prejudice things that we find out later, particularly if you've not read this book before or you've only read this one like I have. The first in a trilogy, and she kind of talks about the fact that the story as she kind of drafted it, the story she wanted to tell, just felt like it should be 3, not like maybe 6 or 9 that was shrunk down to 3 and then other bits tacked on each end. But it was always, she just felt it was a trilogy, and she liked that kind of staple of science fiction and fantasy writing in 3s, which is something that I also love. Although if it happens to be 9 or 12, I'm often quite happy with that as well. So the sequel came out in October 2014, and then which is called Ancillary Sword, and then Ancillary Mercy, which is the concluding part, 2015. And there's a couple of short stories also in this universe as well. And more recently, she's published some fantasy, The Raven Tower, which I think was 2019. Because she was a little bit older as a writer, she had a life before she got into writing. So she's been a waitress and a receptionist, a rod man on a land surveying crew. I think that's the person that holds the pole, and a recording engineer. And she's from St. Louis, Missouri. So that's Leckie. Quite an interesting story there. And I wonder whether there's things we unpick about whether that comes out in the story or not. So what is the story? If you've not read it for a while, this is your short little primer about what goes on. So it's a kind of slightly kind of punky, I suppose, kind of not very hard, kind of space opera-y science fiction novel in the tradition of 80s and 90s British science fiction. When we get to the end of my thoughts, I might talk a little bit about the kinds of authors it reminded me of and the kind of space I think this novel exists in. It's a first-person narrative that's told by one character. We'll again come on to how accurate that is as a description of what's going on. And it tells a couple of kind of time frames throughout the story, about a kind of, or 3 time frames about one story over that time from this person's perspective. And it's about kind of futuristic humanity. I always love those kind of stories, seeing where humanity might go. This is a humanity that is incredibly divorced, kind of explicitly divorced from Earth and from our origins. So it's a long time in the future, but when in the future is left completely unsaid. But it's thousands and thousands and thousands of years. So a really interesting kind of world that's been built here. She talks quite a bit about enjoying the feeling that the world spreads beyond the pages, which I really like. So it feels like a kind of a lived-in kind of space. So the pitch is a bit difficult to describe, I think. I might just read the back. On a remote icy planet, the soldier known as Breck is drawing closer to completing her quest. Breck is both more than she seems and less than she was. Years ago, she was the Justice of Torren, a colossal starship and an artificial intelligence controlling thousands of soldiers in the service of the Ratch, the empire that conquered the galaxy. An act of treachery has ripped it all away, leaving her with only one fragile human body, but that might just be enough to take revenge against those who destroyed her. So it's revenge, it's kind of AI, it's far future, and quite interesting. So what is the plot? What are we talking about here in the story? Again, very brief primer if you've not read it in a while. So the plot follows this character who is both Breck and the Justice of Torren, this kind of spaceship AI that has previously had all of these kind of human vassals for its intelligence and has been split apart, and we follow one of those vassals mostly as they take revenge for the person who's caused the sundering. and this is taking place over this kind of revenge quest has taken place over about 20 years or so, kind of the plotting and the planning and the kind of realizing of it. We get content earlier on when the AI is all together, so you see all these different perspectives from one kind of character. But essentially, it's this revenge story is the driver of the plot. How Breck is going to enact revenge and following through on that story. It's also an odd couple story. We'll talk a bit about the characters later on, but Breck ends up acquiring a, at the beginning at least, pretty useless companion. And it's also a story of how they kind of help each other heal and how they build a relationship that helps drive some of the plot along. And I think it's also a story about empire. It's a story about empires, how they're structured, how they run, and the limitations and the moral complexities of being an expansionist society where you're expanding to is not empty. Which, again, we'll talk about, I think, in the kind of themes and the things that I want to get into. So what about themes? Well, the first thing that I thought I would mention is the title of the book, because I think when I read it, and also probably when I read it the first time, I wasn't thinking about it too deeply. So Breck is, one of these vassals is an ancillary. And it's an ancillary of the Justice of Torrent. So Ancillary Justice is a bit like 7 of 9. It's the name of the character. But more importantly, I think, the sense of justice is one of the core principles of the society in which we are existing. And I think justice is a theme throughout this novel. What is justice? Who gets to decide? And is, personal justice different and more important than a kind of wider sense of justice? And what do you do if there are no mechanisms for justice in the society in which you live? And that is essentially what we're dealing with here. So I suppose this is the setting bit I didn't get into. The world in which we're existing here is one that is ruled by one person who has kind of taken over the Raj society, or Raj society, and kind of rules with an iron fist, and rules by having lots of different versions of them that are all connected, human versions. And we kind of see an opposition between Breck and Justice of Torrent's sense of justice and our ruler's sense of justice, and how those two things collide. So I think there's something really interesting there about justice and its relationship with society. On the similar kind of theme, I think this book is really interested in concepts of inequality and in society, and power balances and relationships. And it's really concerning itself all the way through with who has control, who has power, who has influence, and how that works in society. And in the time of which we see the events happen, the fragmentation of a previously quite hierarchical, feudal way of running a society to something that's a little bit more meritocratic and a bit more fair, and the friction and the tensions when inequality starts to be broken down. I'm not sure whether Leckie was considering this concept as something that was a key part of what she wanted to talk about in the story, but it's certainly something that came across to me that it was an important element of what was going on. You might be wondering what I'm doing. I'm just double checking that everything's working, and it looks pretty good. So back on with the show. Remember, if you want to drop comments in the chat, I'll see them at this end, and we can link them into the conversation. So be having a think about themes, because I've got a few to get through. So I think you'll catch up on me as you're going. Another thing, a kind of theme that really came through for me was about empire, as I mentioned. And this comes in lots of different ways. one of which I think is about singing. So we're going to talk a bit about singing later on, but the sense of songs as embodying fragments of conquered people, a folk memory that kind of exists on the margins. And I think this is something that we can see in our own society. We can see remnants of cultures that have been oppressed by others, have been invaded by others. So I think this is a little window into that, that there's two things going on here. So one of which, and you can see this by interviews with Leckie, is that she was interested in kind of building a fictional empire anyway, partly just to test it and see how it might operate. Here are some parameters for it. What does that look like? There's a kind of, we're going to use the word anthropology a lot in this hour, but also I think she's interested in really analysing what the effect of living in an empire is, and to be colonised by somebody else at gunpoint, and kind of what happens to the people in those societies. And I think we get that in two ways. We never get so yes. Before I should probably say, she talked quite a lot in interviews that the Roman Empire was one of the key models for her when building Ratch space and the empire and how it operates. That kind of ever-expanding, long-term, kind of civil wars kind of empire. It was a big model for her. But what you don't get in this story is Rome. You don't get the home empire, the home world. Everything takes place on the margins, on newly conquered or on long-term conquered places. I think that's a really interesting way of doing things. You would kind of expect the finale of this to be happening in the centre of things. And it's only really mentioned at the very end of the story at all. Now, I would perhaps assume that the third book will end in that Dyson sphere where it all began, but I wouldn't want to presume that because I'm not sure this story takes all of those easy options. So we get a big chunk of story which is a occupation. It is the process of colonization happening in real time and being done in a way that's more sensitive than in previous examples, and how that is a controversial thing. Obviously, you can never colonize nicely. It's never a thing you really want to do, that you can do in that way, or that's morally right to do. But I think it's just exploring how empires are built and how they're maintained. And I found that really interesting. So I think that there is a sense there of, what is an empire and how does it operate? There's also a huge thing there that's kind of parallel with this equality in society, which is about the core of humanity. So how are we human beings? What are the things that we always do, no matter what the cultural constructs, no matter what the society it looks like? Do we always operate in the same way? So we always do similar things. So we're going to talk a little bit about gender as we go on through, and we're going to talk a little bit about kind of feudal, highly hierarchical society, and whether actually this story is kind of exploring, well, if you take away some of the things that our society struggles with in terms of inequality, do other things replace it? Is there always reasons for people to oppress or to judge, hold down others? And it's just, something fills that void. I mean, that's definitely a theme that this book has a conversation with our society about. The other thing that I think it comes across as a theme is, it's a difficult one to articulate. I think if I had never read any interviews with Leckie, I would have said to you, so I think a theme is, what does it mean to be human? Because we've got a central character who is a human body and an artificial mind, and is existing in a human world on their own. So I think that would have been a really nice discussion about how this fits in with a a long process of writing of stories through time where it explores this idea, a conversation about Pinocchio and about iRobot. But Anne Leckie says this isn't what's going on. This isn't a Pinocchio story. So there's something here thematically which I want to have a conversation with. I'm not sure I've got to the bottom of. What is this? What is this doing? There's an interesting passage where the book discusses the fact that artificial intelligences have feelings because ships' brains can only operate if they've got feelings and choice. They have to be managed and they have to be kind of programmed in or set up in a way that means they're likely to be loyal, but they still have to have feelings and agency, and that is a designed-in process. We're not living in a world here where artificial intelligences have broken the bonds of their programming and gained sentience. Breck is designed to be the way that they are, mostly. Although there are hints that something has gone on here which is different to any other ship AI. But so yeah, I'm not quite sure if the theme here is more about if there's a maybe if there's a theme at all, or if actually the Breck and the Justice of Turin is a vehicle for Anne Leckie to explore humanity from the outside. We'll come on to that, I think, and I'd love to know what you reckon about this. So that's kind of themey things. I haven't got much for so I normally do a things I noticed section, and there isn't much in here actually. I think a lot of it is in stuff I want to talk about, which we'll kind of come on to. What I did want to just note is that I think the beginning of this book is really cool. It's a really interesting and economical start. I love that the first paragraph is written like it's a police procedural. There's a body in the ice, and then it's immediately, I don't care, and it's not my job. I'm here for something else. And this kind of icy winter wonderland. You also get introductions to what society we're in and the kind of world that we're living in, and some of the moral choices that are going to be happening throughout the book, all going on in this first couple of pages. And I just found it a really interesting start point. I did read a review of this book, which its only complaint, I think, really was that the first section of it was quite confusing because we've got different timelines. I found that okay. I'm quite used to reading those kind of structures, I think. Again, we'll talk about maybe what some of the influences of this book are and other authors later on. But I just thought it was a really cool kind of way to kick off this kind of icy world. It's all a bit grim and damaged. We know we're not in for a nice ride, and I think that was a really nice way to start. That's the thing that I noticed the most. Probably also it's worth mentioning quickly tea. What I want you to think about for comments in the chat is, what is tea's place in this story? Because that is the other thing that's very obvious, is that tea is a massive part of things. Theories about the British Empire and tea's place in that are very welcome, of course. Okay, so characters. I don't think I can pronounce any of these names. I think that's fine. I think you'll forgive me for this and probably have your own ideas of how they're pronounced. So I always love talking about the characters. What I haven't done this time actually is do too much research into what their names mean. This is something that I normally love to do, but I read one of the interviews I read with Anne Leckie. She hadn't even necessarily thought about what one sounded like. So I think there are rules to names in the story, but I decided, apart from thinking a bit about justice, I didn't want to get too much into the name meanings here because I don't think they're as relevant to this story as they might be to others. So I already mentioned we've got the Justice of Turin. So the Justice of Turin is a spaceship with a distributed AI throughout, lots of human bodies which have had the AI kind of implanted in them. There is no information here about how that works, but I get the sense that the AI operates via implants that connect it to all its other constituent parts, and then the consciousness is put over the brain of the human being that's being captured and kind of stored ready for this purpose. And there is a point early on in the story where somebody offers Justice to kind of have the AI peeled away and the human being underneath reconstructed. That obviously doesn't go down that well. So it's a really interesting character for me. I was trying to recall as I was reading if I'd read other stories where this kind of perspective was the key one. I've read a lot of novels, a lot of short stories where artificial intelligence is the narrator, is the key story. But I don't think you get many instances where that AI is distributed in the way that this one is. And actually that there's personality in all of the nodes in this. Not all parts of Justice are created even. And I don't know whether this is, whether we'll find out maybe in the later novels, whether this is a rarity or whether this is by design. But One-esque, which is the kind of cohort of which Breck is a number of, has a personality. One-esque is its own entity and it stands aside from all of its other elements of Justice. So there's something there to unpick, I think. In terms of Breck as a character, we will talk about autism in a bit, but what the character is like is quite interesting for me as well. And this, I think, Breck represents something really interesting. If you read about how Leckie writes, she says that she stalks the corridors of university libraries, picking up shiny anthropology books. I would describe Breck as an anthropologist. I would describe our narrator as an anthropologist. Somebody outside of the society of which they're in, confused quite often by the society of which they're in, but fascinated by the society they're in, and they're kind of observing. This could be a kind of work of anthropology in some cases, observing the customs and traditions and the variances between human beings in various parts of the society in which the story takes place. I think that's really cool. I think when we talk about influences, we'll talk about the culture and we'll talk about how some of those characters operate as kind of anthropologists at the fringes of human society. But it was a really nice way, I think, of exploring the universe that she's built, because we're kind of getting a middle person to it. We've also got Seivarden. Yeah, this is one that I just couldn't pronounce. I gave up thinking about what it might be. So this is a very damaged person that Justice kind of collects at the beginning of the story. That's the body in the ice. Someone that she knew 1,000 years ago that's kind of come out of a kind of a pod into a world that is 1,000 years on, or into a universe that's 1,000 years on and doesn't really know what they're doing. So I think, again, operates as a bit of an anthropologist, knows the society and doesn't know the society all at the same time, knows some of the conventions but doesn't know all the rules. So I think they actually complement each other quite nicely, partly because they are very different personalities, so they can kind of counterbalance each other and drive each other on and help the story push along where one or the other of them has a kind of crisis or something they want to do. Not necessarily, for me, the most exciting of characters. He reminded me a bit of perhaps, I'm sure there's a character in The Expanse that they reminded me of, which kind of more of a vessel for the story rather than a really kind of person themselves. They're a recovering addict, so I wonder in the second story whether they kind of start to properly come into their own. A lot of personality, but not much of a person for me yet as a character. The big bad, I don't know if bad's the right word, of the story is Ananda Mianai. So Anne Leckie says she didn't realise that the surname sounded like me and I until somebody pointed it out. So it just shows you, doesn't it, that writers don't always pick up on everything that they create themselves. So this is the ruler of the kind of galaxy-wide civilization of which we find ourselves in. And another really interesting character, I think, and an interesting counterpoint. So this is massively spoilery. We've got Justice of Torren on one side, who is a node in a system that's been left in isolation and then has had to kind of develop on their own and develop into a personality on their own. On the other side, we've got a person who has replicated and networked themselves and has split away from themselves. And this is where that kind of civil war takes place. So you might want to suggest that this character represents not necessarily a person, but a kind of body politic. If you think about the Roman Empire, is Ananda representative of the kind of governing class of Rome, rather than Caesar or Brutus or anybody like that, or Nero? Is this a kind of representative thing? And when we get into Let's Talk About, there's lots there we can talk about in terms of personalities. The other characters that I wanted to mention, because they're obviously very important to the story, we've got Orn and Skiat, and we've got Stringen. So Stringen is the doctor near the beginning. I think I still need to unpick a bit in my mind what the doctor represents. I think possibly what the doctor represents is the rational bit of our brains saying, well, this is all a bit mad, isn't it? But I think also represents the bit of this society that yearns for a non-colonizing approach to things, and a kind of memorializing for cultures that have been lost and have been kind of kicked underfoot by invasion, possibly. But also about choices, I think, in the early part of the novel, and perhaps an alternative for justice. But in the end, it was kind of, that's the decision point. That's like, yeah, we're definitely going through with this quest. It's definitely happening. So Orn and Skiat are the two lieutenants on the planet which is got where Oars is, which is where a good chunk of the flashback story is set. I found these characters really interesting because they kind of represent, in some ways, those kind of feuding Roman senators, maybe. I'd like to know what you think about that. But also perhaps about that kind of a growing conscience for people who exist within an empire and don't necessarily agree with the society in which they exist. They have to exist within it, they have to operate within it, and they have to do the bidding of the empire. But they try and subvert it in ways they can because they can see from outside. So they're perhaps, if we think about these characters with the kind of empire in the middle, and then quite a lot of the people that we follow are kind of half in, half out in terms of their intellectual engagement with empire. In fact, our big bad, our empire ruler, is split down the middle. Justice is kind of with is and isn't, and Saivarden is and isn't, and the lieutenants are kind of is and isn't. They're all people that are starting to stretch this long project, this kind of accepted way of doing things, and saying, well, actually, is this right? Do we need to do something else? The only other thing that occurred to me that I wanted to bring up in the character section is there was a little quote to pull out from quite early in the story, I think. I'm equipment, not a person. I just wanted to, I suppose, bring that in to reinforce that Leckie isn't trying to make Justice of Torren and Breck into a person. It's kind of sentient equipment. I think that's a very hard thing to keep in your mind as you're reading the story, and perhaps is a comment on how we like to anthropomorphize things, and the danger of that when the things are saying, I'm not a person, I'm a thing, and it doesn't make me less valid or my interests less useful. And maybe Justice is on a quest to actually internalize that, and it's at the end of the story that they start to accept that they've got a, even though they're not a human being, they've got a human body, but they're not a human being, they've got a place within the society. So I think that's quite an interesting thing to consider. So what I've got left here is things that I wanted to talk about, I suppose, things that just occurred to me or were interesting. We've got about 25 minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and then a couple of minutes to type at the end, something like that. So now is a good time if you want to drop things in the chat, if you want to contribute, things that you might want to talk about that you want to bring into the conversation. So let's start by talking about the narrator. I'm always interested in choices of narrators, and Leckie has kind of talked a bit about the she found it really interesting and inspiring, the idea that she could have a narrator who had lots of different perspectives. But I wonder whether the long gestation of the novel was partly because she had a life going on, but also because she was just trying to figure out what that really meant and the way to explore that to its fullest, particularly in the early stages, in the flashback stages on Oars, where you get all these different perspectives of the same thing happening. And it is a bit of a cheat, I think. It's a bit of a cheat, not a cheat, because the narrator can tell a first-person narrative, but cover lots of different things happening at once. And you kind of get this sense of there's this and this and this and this and this, which is quite cool, I think. But the thing that really I wanted to talk about was that this is one of those first-person narrations where the narrator is talking to us about everything they're thinking and they're feeling, and they're being seemingly quite open about that, I think. But they're also withholding information as we go along to help with the plot. It's a plot device approach, or it's a storytelling approach. But I found that quite interesting, that the narrator isn't giving us all the details when we want them. It's giving us all the details at the right place in the story. And I think that works really well for me in this. I never felt annoyed by that, I don't think. Maybe there's one or 2 points where you're like, well, just tell us, because the action kind of cuts away to something else, or the story cuts away to something else. But I suppose that's the quest is always quite clear, and we kind of know where this is going reasonably early on in terms of what we think the end game might be, or what the character wants to do. Staying with Breck and Justice of Torren, and kind of going back, I think, to Ananda as well. Ananda. Let's go with Ananda. I really enjoyed the interrogation of the differences between, or maybe the raising of is a better term. You know, what's a multi-personality? What's a split personality? Are either of those the right terms for the two characters in this who have multiple instances of themselves? So Justice of Torren is in some ways one personality. It's one AI. But that's not quite true, because One-esque sings. We'll talk a bit about singing maybe in a moment. One-esque sings. It's noticeable to everybody who interacts with One-esque, this kind of cohort from Justice of Torren, that One-esque sings. It's different. It's noticeably different. It has a personality. I don't know if we quite get to where that comes from and where that's happened. It might be that this is Ananda's meddling in the programming of the computer, of editing One-esque, has forced a bit of a divide between it and the rest of Justice. And I think even if it wasn't intended, the narration is written from the perspective of a slightly separate. I never felt like the bits where One-esque was describing its own activities were more palpable than when it's describing its activities when it was one var or two-esque. They were almost like it was happening as a dream, or as somebody, a kind of an echo of somebody else's activity. So it's a really nuanced thing for me. What Breck is, what One-esque is, in amongst a kind of distributed AI, or lots of kind of nodes of an AI that have a central control point, perhaps. I think there's lots to unpack there, which I found really interesting. I don't necessarily think there was all the answers. And then for me, that contrast is there with Ananda, who is a really interesting case. Are we looking at a split personality? What is a personality when you've cloned and networked yourself and there's lots of you? You must all be operating individually and making your own choices, a bit like One-esque is doing, and all of the ancillaries are doing. Are they the same? Are they different? I'd love to know what you think, because I'm not sure if I've got all the answers. The next thing that I wanted to bring up are the two really notable things here about the character and the story, which I think have heavily featured in reviews and interviews about this story. The first one is autism. Anne Leckie is on record as saying that she didn't write Breck to be an autistic or a neurodiverse character. But a wonderful thing has happened, as far as I can tell, where readers who are neurodiverse, neurodivergent, they've embraced a character that struggles to pick up on all the social cues and the rules of the society they're in. So Breck struggles to identify gender because, as we'll talk about, the culture that they've been created in doesn't really recognise gender. So they don't have those rules. They don't express themselves unless they think about it, and then they copy what they've seen from other people, and they try and guess if their reaction is right. So lots of things here which are challenges for people who are autistic, sometimes challenges for people that are autistic. So I really love that Anne Leckie's very happy with that, and I think happy that she's provided something for people, but interesting that that wasn't in her mind when she was writing the story. I'd love to know what you think about that, and how useful that is to think about. Gender is the other side of things. So gender, as I mentioned, is not a feature of the society of which the Raj society, there's other things that they use to differentiate people and their place in society. It's more about social status and family. But gender is there all the time. I think some of this is because the anthropologistness of Anne Leckie kind of is exploring what happens when you do that. It's a kind of sandbox thing, I think. But it also does lead us to really reflect on, well, what is the place of gender in the future? And I think this book feels a lot more current now than it did when it was published in 2013, where now we might want to look forward more obviously to a society where gender is a person's personal choice and society doesn't care or doesn't make a bit of a difference about it. So yeah, I think it was really interesting. The other strand for me, two more strands I think that I wanted to talk about. So one of these was language and meaning. And I think this is also rooted in that anthropology side of things. That language and people talking at cross purposes and people's nuances of language are a really strong element of this story. And there's a few occasions quite early on, I think, in the narrative, maybe in the first third of the book, where the language that's being used for conversation does not match the conversation that needs to happen. There isn't words to express what's going on. There isn't the nuances of language to express what's going on, because, like with gender, the Ratch is a society where sometimes things just aren't grey enough, I suppose. And maybe this is the point that we're coming to, is that this is the story of a society that's introducing grey. It's a society that's had black and white. It's had do what your ruler tells you to do, or it's bad. And increasingly there's a splintering, which is grey. The grey is there in the leader and having two different perspectives, and the society's kind of been existing with them in a Cold War, and that's resulted in grey. It's there in all of those other characters on the fringes and how they're starting to interact with the society they're in. It's grey. And you get the sense that the language of this empire is going to have to evolve. It's going to have to introduce new words because it needs more grey in the language because there is grey in the society. And perhaps there's something about how language is generated by the society and how it operates, and it fulfills a need. Something I think we can see with the internet culture and how that pushes language. And we have to create ways of expressing new things all the time. So I could see this galaxy-spanning civilization having to invent new nuances as part of the action in the book. So I thought it was really cool and probably worth, a PhD about how that all fits together. And then the last kind of big thing that I wanted to discuss was fate. I thought this was, again, really interesting. I think there was an element here that came from her research into the Roman Empire and Roman society, although also not, was the influence, two things. There's the influence of fate on how people think about themselves, but also whether fate is a part of this universe. So the first part is that people in this story believe in fate. They don't kind of believe in chance encounters necessarily. They don't believe that things just happen for no reason. And they also trust to the kind of casting of stones to help them determine what they do. So fate is kind of wedded into the society we're in. But that interesting question for me then is, well, is there fate in this story? Or is it random chance? And we're confronted from that right at the beginning, page 1 and 2. Breck encounters someone she already knows, and the person that ends up being perfect for her fulfilling her quest. Just the very person she needs. She probably can't complete her quest without this person. So do we think that Leckie has introduced fate into this story? Are things fated to be? That is right at the beginning, and then right at the end, when we're on that provincial backwater that could be anywhere, people turn up in the story who are just the people that we've already met. Now, I think if this was a different writer, maybe, or if fate wasn't an important component, I think we'd have ended up on that provincial world because those characters were there. It would be written so it wasn't a surprise. I think Breck would have sought out that they were there, and that it would have had a kind of different, maybe not a different ending, but a different interpretation of the ending. But I think this is a deliberate bringing of fate, in that the child who's grown up and the lieutenant, they are there in the right place at the right time, and that the fates have brought all of these characters and all of Justice's formative experiences on Oars, and what happens with the Justice just afterwards. That all those strands, fate has brought them together to this place, and it kind of had to happen. That is what I think the novel is doing. And I'd love to know what you think about whether that is deliberate, or if it's something that, I'm reading into it. I think this is on purpose. I think this is a universe of fate, and I'm really interested to see what happens in the other two stories, whether this continues and whether everything's kind of fated to be, or it's introduced that it's a random universe and sometimes the chips fall in the right place. And maybe this has happened to lots of other people and it's just not worked out because of chance, and this is the 1 in a billion in all those thousands of years. This is the 1 in a billion occurrence where it's happened. And it occurs to me now that actually there's an external driver to events here, which is perhaps an influence on this kind of wider arc of fate and story, and that is the aliens. They are the true enigmas here, and they're the true things that are driving this story. Both the great name, the who are involved in this incident where there's a rebellion and the splitting of the personality of Ananda, but also the Preska, who are these kind of like threat, who the existential threat, which I'm sure we'll get more of in the later stories. So these are agents of change in society. These are external things. These are the Goths. These are the or the Visigoths. These are, external changes to society, which I think is probably something we could talk about for another half an hour if we needed to. But how are they fated to arrive at this time, or does fate not exist and it just happens to be that this is the way it goes? Are people who are damaged and in need of answers or in need of a safe space, do they congregate in this provincial world because that is just the most natural place for them all to be? Although I think in a whole galaxy that's unlikely. Let me know what you think. Let me know what you think about fate being in the story and how relevant that is for what we're talking about here, because I think it's got no easy answers. Okay, so we've got about 9 minutes left. What I thought I might finish on is talking about what this story reminded me of. One of the reasons that I loved it is because it's my kind of story. It's the first one in a trilogy, but also it's that kind of sarcastic, sardonic, and spaceships and kind of space opera-y, far future-y story that I really love. If you've watched my book collection videos, you'll know that the authors that loom really large in my collection are Ian M. Banks and Alistair Reynolds, Peter Hamilton. I've got lots of similar kind of writing, particularly books that I bought over about 10, 15 years from the millennium onwards, which are in a similar kind of space. And there were two authors that were palpable to me in the reading of the story. The lesser one was probably Alistair Reynolds, and it didn't really occur to me, although I was thinking about the Revelation space stories in particular. There's a moment in the narrative where Justice talks about Justice maybe. So talks about being in this kind of bit of humanity which has done all the modification and is changing their bodies and their minds, and they think bog standard humans are weird, but they're on the fringe. That was a Reynoldsy moment for me. That was the Revelation space, changing your body, and I wondered if that was a little nod to those books in particular, and other authors that have explored a similar space and similar ideas about post-human construction of bodies and minds. But a little nod to say, yeah, I know this kind of thing could happen, but actually in my universe, the dominant culture has decided that that's not for them, that they don't want to pollute their bodies with all these genetic changes, and that's what's won. I thought that was quite cool, quite interesting. So there was an echo there for me of Alistair Reynolds. But the key one was Ian M. Banks. I think that's probably not a surprise. And I would assume that lots of people that read this book who had been reading particularly British sci-fi in the 80s and 90s would have a similar experience to me, I think. I found the thing that is great about the culture novels in particular is that they explore the fringes of a society where it butts up against competing visions, but the big difference here, of course, is that we're not in the culture, we're in the Ratch, which is almost like the opposite of the culture. I think it's a kind of mirror universe of the culture as far as I'm concerned. It spans a huge distance. There doesn't seem to be much in the way of scarcity if people want stuff, but this is a kind of hierarchical and ruled by a dictator and expansionist in the worst ways. But it's maybe a critique of the culture, which is still kind of an empire builder. It tries to not be, it tries to not fight too much, but it tries to do kind of empire building by stealth. It tries to influence societies until they're ready to be included in the fold. It's a kind of more benevolent way of doing things. Maybe this story is saying that no matter how you do it, it's wrong. Maybe that's what Orn is supposed to can represent to us. It's a critique in a way of this wonderful utopian culture, which we would all love to live in because it's so amazing, but we don't often we wouldn't have to think about what happens at the fringes. But that's what Ian Banks is interested in. So yeah, that was the real vibe for me. And also, there's AIs with personality, and I think he was a real pusher of that idea of AIs that felt like people, ships that felt like people, even if their names in this story aren't quite as on the nose as they are in the culture with ship AIs and station AIs and all that kind of stuff. So I thought that was really cool, and I really liked that it reminded me of those stories that I love. I think the other element of that is that our central character, Breck, I think could easily be an Ian Banks main character, reminding me of some of those protagonists from Against the Dark Background, or I'm just looking at my Banks collection there, or Use of Weapons, a similar kind of narration, I think, going on there, which I thought was really cool. So that's Ancillary Justice. I would highly recommend it as a book to read. I think it's really interesting, and it rips along at a really good pace as well. Rereading it has made me think I really need to move on now and read the other two, because I kind of want to know what happens next. I want to get into that story. I want to see what the logical endpoint is. What is fate going to bring? What's Breck going to be at the end? And how is this society going to look? I want to know more about the aliens. I want to know more about other planets and other ships, and see more of this world, because I think it should be really cool to experience what's going on in this space, and that and Leckie's joy at exploring this universe that she's created, I think, is quite infectious. So yeah, I'd highly recommend you read it, because I think it's really, really cool, and I think you'll get a lot out of it as well. So yeah, that's the end of the book chat. If you're watching this back on stream, then leave comments. It'd be really great to hear what you think about this story and whether you enjoy it or not, or things that you've taken from it, and recommendations for maybe other stories that are in a similar kind of space that you think we should talk about. That'd be really cool. We'll be returning at the end of March for our next book club, and I'll be posting on social media what that's going to be in the near future. You can check out our bookshop.org link, because that gives information about all the books that we're going to be talking about over the next few months, so you can get a bit ahead of the game if you want to read anything else. And we really look forward to seeing you for the next one at the end of March. If you can't wait for more Cosmia content, there is loads more on our YouTube channel. There's all of last year's book clubs and festival events, as well as extra information and videos about my book collection, and the first video about my exploration of years in my collection which are underrepresented. And we've started with the year 2000. The next one that will be coming at some point over the next month or two will be 2001. So lots for you to enjoy in there. If you've loved this video, there's the Ko-Fi link if you want to add stuff to that. Get in touch with us on social media if you want to chat about books or films or anything else. And in the meantime, stay safe, and we'll see you soon.